Welcome everyone jumping in. We're just going to give it a couple of moments to allow folks to have time to join the webinar, and then we'll get started. Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for this month's episode of When Things Go Wrong. Let me kick it over to David Valancourt, CEO and founder of the GMP Collective, to get us started.
Awesome. Thanks, Bethany. It is great to see so many familiar faces, names on the attendee list. Thanks so much for coming. This is I can't believe our 19th episode. We're almost into another decade of numbers. I want to go over just a couple of housekeeping items before we kick off. We've got a great episode today that Bethany is going to run with our exciting panelists, Dylan and Ginny. But first, couple housekeeping items. We did receive some great questions during the registration, so thank you. If the conversation sparks any ideas of questions you'd like to ask, we've got two amazing experts here. Put your questions in the Q&A, and as time permits, we will do our best to answer them live. This is your opportunity. This webinar, as all webinar episodes, are for you guys, the audience. So we really want your questions and to address them because I guarantee you that if you've got something on your mind, somebody else in the audience or somebody watching it later probably does as well. You can also ask it anonymously if you're not comfortable with sharing who you are, where you're associated with, so that is totally fair. This webinar, just like all other 19, are recorded and are made available on our website and on our YouTube channel for free. So if you've got to jump early, if you have a friend or colleague that you want to make sure gets to catch this afterwards, while they don't get the pleasure of being able to ask the questions and enjoy the real-time energy, please send them over to our website to check out this and other episodes. And with that, we've got 55 minutes and counting to be mindful of everybody's time. So I'm going to hand it back over to Bethany to get us going.
Great. Thanks, David. I'm happy to be your moderator of When Things Go Wrong to discuss various challenges and issues within the cannabis industry with the aim of offering valuable insights, tips, and solutions. I'm Bethany Moore, as you mentioned, the Director of Content Strategy and Market Growth here at the GMP Collective. Excited to continue working with all these brilliant and passionate experts in the cannabis and hemp industry. So contact us today to learn more about our services, including technical and strategic advising, client referral program, and webinar sponsorship opportunities. So let's get started. You've already met David Valancourt, and I will introduce our guest, Dylan Wilkes, who is the CTO of Orange Photonics. Spectroscopy, entrepreneurship, and invention are a family legacy for Dylan. His grandfather is the father of infrared technology and one of the analytical testing industry founders in the 1940s. Dylan has extensive experience within both infrared, spectroscopy, and chromatography disciplines. He's designed instrumentation that serves aerospace, petroleum, beverages and pharmaceutical industries, and chaired an ASTM method. He founded Orange Photonics in the spring of 2015 and now applies his skills to the cannabis and psychedelics industries. Welcome today, Doug.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Also joining us is Ginny Glaros, the Chief Scientific Officer at Modern Canna Labs in Lakeland, Florida. She received her bachelor's degree with honors in biochemistry from the University of West Florida. In May of 2022, she earned her master's in medical cannabis science and therapeutics from the University of Maryland, Baltimore. Before entering the cannabis industry, she gained valuable research experience at several well-respected institutes, including Emory University, National Institute of Aging, and University of Florida. She's been the lab director at Modern Canna Labs since January of 2018 and was promoted to CSO in August of 2022. Congrats. She's extremely involved in the cannabis industry and serves on the scientific advisory board for CanMed and Cloud Limbs, and is a member of CASP Advisory Panel and the Proficiency Testing Advisory Task Force with AOAC International. Also a member of the Cannabis Working Group D37 with ASTM International. What a great crowd we have today. Thank you all for joining us. I'm excited for this conversation. So this show is about fit for purpose testing methods. Let's start by defining that. What exactly do we mean by fit for purpose testing methods in the context of the cannabis industry, and why is this crucial for ensuring product quality and safety? Ginny, could you kick us off, please?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today. So when we talk about fit for purpose testing, we're really talking about testing products in a way that tells the consumers what they're truly getting, meaning that the results on a certificate of analysis they receive actually match what the consumer is going to get. So when we think about examples of that, in some states, flower is tested after harvesting. So it's harvest, it's cured, and then it's tested before it's ever gone through the manufacturing process, the packaging process. Well, by the time it gets to the consumer's hands, it no longer matches what that original test result has. So you are going to lose some of those trichomes, some of that resin in the packaging process. You may add contaminants in the packaging process. So if we're testing a product in a way that is not fit for purpose, intended for what the consumer is going to get, are they really getting the information they need? Another part of that would be, just testing a little bit of flower and then placing a cannabinoid and terpene label on that product. Is that really fit for purpose? Are we telling the consumers what they're getting? Or are we giving them a number that is very generalized that may not be real? So I think it goes into a lot of the laboratory's processes and a lot of the methods that are being utilized by the laboratories to make sure that they match what we are looking to achieve and what we are looking to tell the consumers.
Just wanted to add a couple of things to that. I think Jenny's got it really nailed right on the head there. One of the things that we've thought about a lot is how we can apply what's being done in other kind of similar industries. If you look at food industries or pharmaceuticals, they do a lot of the similar kind of fit for purpose testing. And I think it's important to realize that while cannabis is certainly unique, it's not something that is, testing products in such a way that it is useful and meaningful to the end user is something that's done all the time in other industries. So I think we can put some thought into how to, integrate some of those lessons learned from other industries as well. And one of the things that I am particularly interested in is testing across the product cycle, as well as kind of that fit for purpose, meaning end user, making sure that they understand and that the test makes sense for the end user, but also understanding what the product is doing across the life cycle, because it ultimately will allow you to have more consistent and higher quality products.
Great. So let's talk about some different types of tests that exist, like yeast or mold or pesticides, which would be for consumer safety, versus potency, which is a different type of labeling. What are the purpose of these tests, as well as the margins of error in batch size, for example? Dylan?
Sure, I can talk a lot about the potency side since that's what our company focuses on. But I do understand there's a big difference between something like potency, which is important from a labeling perspective, because ultimately this is what the consumer is actually purchasing is cannabinoids. But equally important is some of those safety type aspects when we're talking about yeast and molds or heavy metals and things like that. Those are kind of in some ways more important. I mean, I would be a little upset if my wine that I bought was 3%, even though it said 12.5%, but I'm going to be a lot more upset if I get really sick or die from drinking a bottle of wine. So they both have kind of this different reasons to exist. And I think it's important to kind of separate, especially those two, the labeling side of things and the safety side of things, because they're so different and so important. And I think in both cases, things like batch sizes or understanding the process around testing is going to really depend a lot on what you're trying to test and what you're trying to get out of it. It's a lot different to understand whether there's yeast and mold in something than it is to understand potency. And I think Jenny probably knows better about some of those other tests, but I wanted to at least point out the kind of major difference there. That's a really important one.
Yeah, I have to agree with what Dylan says is when we're, defining these things, one is for labeling versus one is for consumer safety. And even going farther than that, when we talk about things, for example, like pesticides, we know cannabis is a bioaccumulator and a bioremediator. So it's going to suck up the pesticides from whatever is being added to it. It's going to suck up the heavy metals, and that's going to accumulate in the product. And we know pesticides and heavy metals are bad for you. So we know that we don't want consumers consuming high amounts of those things. However, we have the reverse of that, something like a total yeast and mold test or a total count test, looking at bacteria or molds or yeast, whatever it may be. There are some healthy, good microbes. There are some good microbes that are added to these plants in order to prevent having to use pesticides. So if we're using something like a total yeast and mold test to gauge safety, sometimes it can be a little misconstrued because it may appear unsafe, even though those microbes may be healthy microbes. And there is definitely conversation around how much microbe is too much microbe. But when you look at total yeast and mold testing in other industries, it's used as kind of a sanitation measure, more of a pass-fail measure. And in the cannabis industry, you're often seeing it being used as a pass-fail measure. So is that fit for purpose? Is that really what we should be doing in the cannabis industry? Or should we be using it more as a sanitation kind of measure? And I'm pretty sure, I believe New York recently changed their regs for total yeast and mold to be more of a sanitation measure versus a pass-fail, where labs are testing it, but it doesn't determine if a product makes it to market.
If I can jump in and add to that, I really like to think of it from a quality and safety standpoint. And those two terms are not mutually exclusive. There are differences, but if you think about it from a quality standpoint and go back to what Dylan said around, consumers are buying products that contain cannabinoids, whether it's THC, CBD, CBC, and then of course the terpenoids, right? The terpenes are really important, especially if we're starting, talking about whole plant flower. That has generally a quality standpoint, but there is also a safety standpoint when you consider, if the products are significantly higher or lower than what they're stated on the label claim and the level of intoxication that it can impact. That's a public safety risk, right? That could occur. But then we've got the safety risk around, impurities, and I think to Ginny's point, like, is just yeast and mold generally, is that an impurity, broadly speaking? In some regards, certain strains of Aspergillus, 100%, there's major risks, but there's also beneficial bacteria and molds out and yeast out there, right? So when we're looking at that, we really need to understand that fit for purpose. And a framework that I haven't seen yet, but would love to just throw out there for thoughts to leave folks with is, as we're looking at the labeling, there's criteria around that. There's ranges. Ranges are your friend. So we know this is a heterogeneous product, especially at the flower level. So what's the acceptable range? Is it 20%? Plus or minus 20%? Is it plus or minus 10%? So that when a consumer sees a product that says 20% THC in it, what's the appropriate spread? And that's a different type of test than, does it have pesticides or heavy metals in there? That's a limits test, right? Like, it needs to be below a certain threshold. And unless you're doing spot treatment or putting something, treating a certain plant differently throughout the entire, canopy or batch, you should be able to look at a representative sample and not have that heterogeneity that you do with the cannabinoids that vary based on, the canopy, location in the canopy, top of the plant versus bottom of the plant. So looking at where the accumulations of impurities could be happening and testing that as a separate definition for safety relative to quality, and variability, I think, is a really important concept that we just haven't quite gotten to in the industry, but would benefit everybody if we were to take some of those adoption approaches. So yeah.
Got it. Thank you, David. Yep, that all reminded me to take my probiotic yogurt after this. So moving on. Why do different sample prep methods matter depending on the different types of cannabis products, where there's flower versus concentrate versus edibles that end up on the market? Dylan?
Sure. So I'll let Jenny talk about all the kind of matrix effects and all the fun stuff about the millions of ingredients that people are putting cannabis in. It's kind of crazy how much different things can have cannabinoids in them. But I just want to talk a little bit about especially on the concentration side, there is a huge difference in potency when you look at a typical oil concentrate, for example, that might be 90% THC or whatever cannabinoid, and a beverage which might be below dose beverage, you're talking part per million levels. So you're talking about products that vary in concentration by almost a factor of 1,000,000 and sometimes even more. So of course, there's going to have to be some different treatment of how you process those kind of samples, because no instrument in the world has a range of that kind of dynamic range. So having an ability to adjust your sample prep for the types of products is really important. And then, as I mentioned before, there's so many different types of products that does become a challenge. And the only other thing I wanted to mention, especially on sample prep, is there's also a difference not only in things like concentration and matrix effects, but also in how the context of the test itself. Our company focuses on on-site testing, and we have a lot different sample prep methods than you would see in a laboratory, because we have a disadvantage in that our operator can't be necessarily a trained scientist, whereas in a laboratory like Jenny's, you can rely on someone to do the right thing and to understand procedures and that kind of thing. And so we have this disadvantage where we've got to ensure that our preparations are simple, but we do have the advantage of having kind of this ability to do kind of cheaper things and cut corners where a lab can't, because we can rely on our machine to take care of some of it, versus a laboratory that really needs to make sure everything's exact, because they're doing this for a labeling product, whereas we're often doing this for an R&D or for a process control. So I just want to mention that not on top of the matrix effects, there's also this context of where the product's being tested and why.
Yeah, I think Dylan hit a lot of those really big points of, matrix effect and understanding that these products are going to range drastically. At the end of the day, the way a lab preps a flower isn't going to be the same way that a lab preps a derivative product. And then if we even get into derivative products, I mean, there's hundreds of different types of derivative products that may vary in how they need to be prepped. So a transdermal patch that someone is making is not going to be prepped the same way as diamonds, that pure isolate that people are making. And so labs have to figure that out, and they have to figure out how to make that prep fit the type of matrix that it is, and fit the type of matrix in an appropriate way. And oftentimes, one of the struggles we face as a laboratory is we don't always get told when there's a new product type coming, and it shows up at the lab and it's like, okay, you have 4 days to figure this out. And it's like, is that really an applicable amount of time for a laboratory to validate a new prep method? Is that enough time for them to figure out the different matrix effects that they're going to see with that product? And it's a battle that labs face. And I think also with prep is you have to take into consideration, another part of it is how you're prepping those samples for the specific analysis. So if we go back to cannabinoids, let's talk about cannabinoids in flower and how that's prepped. If someone is only grabbing a little bit of flower sample and analyzing that for cannabinoids and slapping a label and saying it's 20%, is that representative? And I think that's where these fit for purpose representative samples really play a big role in that. So our laboratory actually did a little internal experiment with this, where we dumped out a couple containers of 3.5 gram jars of flower of the same exact batch, and we took each individual bud and analyzed it for cannabinoids, and we saw a 6% swing in what the lowest, like a 6 percentage point, not a 6% RPD, but a 6 percentage point swing. So we're talking 15% to 21%. That's a really big range. So if labs are having the ability in their, it's not being defined in their fit for purpose testing that they need to create a composite that's representative, and they say, ooh, this is the biggest bud with the most resin, and they test that for cannabinoids, is that going to be representative of what the consumer is getting? Probably not, because every consumer is not going to get the biggest, prettiest bud in their jar. And so we have to think about that as well when we're designing these fit for purpose testing and even these recommendations for regulations on how that's going to work. Because if we're not defining what labs need to do, labs do tend to find loopholes, because we do have the THC inflation that plagues the industry. And so we have to think about that and how to eliminate some of those factors, or the, passing products, testing into compliance, all of those things. How can we make fit for purpose methods that will avoid those sorts of things from happening?
Awesome, thanks. So when we're talking about fit for purpose testing methods, what are some of the challenges that labs encounter, and how are you addressing these to maintain accuracy and reliability? I think you were kind of starting to talk on that in your last answer.
Yeah, I do think with fit for purpose, there's many facets to the issue of different challenges that labs are going to encounter. But one of them I do think is going to be regulations, and how the regulations are set, because the regulations may not necessarily be set in a way that the testing is being done fit for purpose, but because as a compliance laboratory, you have to follow those regulations, it may not be best suited, but you have to do what your regulations say. And I think that's where the conversations between the stakeholders and the regulators and the accrediting bodies and organizations like ASTM and AOAC are so important, because that's where we can make that real change. And that's where we can have those conversations about, okay, wait, this is going to affect the accuracy and the validity of the data that the lab is reporting, but the regulations say this. So how do we work together to change that? How do we work together to make it make sense so that the labs can provide accurate and reliable data to the consumers?
And I just want to point out really quickly that I completely agree, especially with your last point on the ASTM, those kind of standards organizations, ASTM, AOAC, being able to participate in those is really important. I know it's kind of a pain in the neck, but if you're in the industry and you're not participating, you really should consider it, because that's where the regulators are there and they're looking at these methods. For example, there is a sampling method for flower that's being worked on in ASTM, and that's really important. And if you have something to say about that and want to try to make this better, we need the expertise and help of both the industry and the regulatory side. So a shameless plug-in away, but there it is. I agree with you 100% on that, Jenny.
I love it. I'm going to add to that with a couple points, and just reflect on what I really like with this panel is that, a lot of folks perceive like Orange Photonics in a testing lab, like, why would they be friends? Like, they should be competitors. It's like, no, you need both for different reasons, right? There's a Venn diagram, and I'm sure there's some overlap that could be argued, but like the value of the data and fit for purpose, my pre-cannabis days was in the environmental world, and there's a difference between doing a rapid test on a GCFID, for those that are familiar, versus putting on a high-res mass spectrometer. There's a cost impact, and there's, whether our clients with the Department of Defense or, other private, consulting firms that were reporting to DoD or DOI or something around a Superfund site. These are major public health risks situations that we were determining values for. And depending on the level of precision and the turnaround time, that was needed, we would employ different, test protocols and different sample preps as well. So you have to consider all that to understand what is fit for purpose. It's not that one is a better test than another. It's just what's more appropriate for the purpose at hand. And, thinking about like the ASTM, AOAC plugs, like how do we get to a place where we have a minimum benchmark? Right? If Ginny wants to go ahead and, she's the chief science officer and has an amazing team that can optimize a method that is better for their clients, that goes above and beyond what the minimum test method can do, that's amazing. Again, I'll plug my EPA days where you read an EPA method and it's like a 30-minute long runtime. That puts a commercial lab out of business. You can't compete with a 30-minute runtime. So if you want to get to a 10-minute runtime and run more samples, you still have to meet the criteria to have resolution of your peaks. But it gives you that minimum to say, this is the best method that is a minimum that will serve fit for purpose. From there, we can go above and beyond. And that's the importance of the opportunity to get alignment across our country for the betterment of patients at the end of the day, right? This is for our consumers.
Really, really excellent points there, David. Thank you for that. I also wanted to take this easy opportunity to promote ASTM's June meeting in Philadelphia and the USP ASTM workshop coming up. So we'll include some of that information in the follow-up email. All right, so let's move right along. Certification programs and accreditation bodies play a role in validating the proficiency and credibility of testing labs, right? Let's talk a little bit more about that. Dylan?
Sure. Why don't I start? Because Ginny probably has a lot more to say about this one too. It's just being a lab. She's probably had a lot more experience, but as an instrument manufacturer, I think it's really important to participate with these groups that are doing accreditation, either by helping our customers or through working with labs. We certainly participate in things like interlaboratory studies and similar programs that are kind of put on by some of these accreditation bodies. But the main reason that I think they're really important is just that same thing we've been talking about before, which is kind of the trust. Really being able to trust that the people that are getting the product are getting what they're expecting to get, and having the the process in place to do that is what these accreditation bodies are assisting with. So definitely an important part. And I think the main thing in our mind, at least, is that trust piece is really where they really come into play.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think too, at the same time, we have to remember that a lot of these accreditation and certification programs are looking at a lot of paperwork versus looking at what you're doing every day in the laboratory. And that's something we also need to remember, because that can impact. A lab can have all of their paperwork in order, but their, house is not in order when you go into the lab. And so you got to take that into consideration. You have to figure out. So I think that inspections where people are coming in and they're watching you, even inspections from regulatory bodies, by all means, come to my lab, watch what we're doing, have us prep a sample for you. I mean, for us, that's really how you're going to be able to gauge the accuracy and the reliability of the data set that's being produced. Walk into a lab if you're a regulator and say, hey, I'm here for a random inspection. I want you to prep this sample from start to finish because this is what you originally got. Let's see what you got this time. If there are bad actors, things are going to get a lot more in order once they start to see that happen, because there's going to be ramifications when that data doesn't match. Again, though, if the test is not fit for purpose, there could be some variance. So all of that stuff has to be considered. So I think that this is, in the cannabis industry, we're ever changing. It is constantly, we're going 1,000 miles per hour. And I think everybody is just trying to keep up. And in some ways, I think that some of these regulations and the accreditation preceded the science maybe, and the fit for purpose methods and the standardized methods, and it created some issues for laboratories, but we're all working through it together. And it's really reassuring to see even the difference that we've made in the last 3 years on these sorts of things. So I am excited for the future, and I do think that accrediting bodies, certification programs, they play a very important role, but we need to remember exactly what they're doing when they're coming into a laboratory at the same time.
Great. Yeah, speaking of regulators, in your experience, how does the patchwork of the state regulatory framework, because there's nothing federal as of yet, unless it gets rescheduled before the end of this webinar, how does that influence the adoption of fit for purpose testing methods in the cannabis industry?
Sure, it
So
certainly leaves a, oh, if you're going to go first, go ahead, Ginny.
you can go first, Dylan, take
Oh.
this one first.
No, go ahead. You know more about this than I do. This is a good one for you.
I really think this is where the conversation starts, right? Did the chicken or the egg come first? So a lot of regulations, when states started passing cannabis programs, there was a lot of pressure to get regulations out for testing labs. And so all of these regulations were created because there was government pressure. We have to get something out. We have to get something out. And now we're seeing that, okay, maybe that wasn't the best fit for purpose. And so now we're attempting to change it. And I think that this is something that is important to recognize, that regulators are trying to change it. They understand that some of these regulations may not be fit for purpose, but the government doesn't move as quickly as this industry is moving. I mean, we're learning new things every day, and the government isn't able to make those changes in regulations on a daily basis. So I think that that's a really big part of this, is remembering that they are working to fix the issues, and things like this webinar, ASTM, AOAC, making those plugs again, those are really important places where regulators and stakeholders can work together and have these conversations and make these changes so that we can all work to better provide consumers with accurate data on the quality and safety of products.
I just want to add a little bit on the kind of from the industry perspective. One of the things that we've seen that's been interesting is when we work with MSOs, a lot of times the way they put to use something like on-site testing is to kind of understand the lay of the land at the different facilities. Like they may be making the same product at multiple facilities in multiple states, or growing the same cultivar or whatever, and being able to apply a testing method that has the same sampling procedure, the same processes and everything, means that they can get data that's comparable between this facility and this facility, and understand, hey, why are these guys reading at X%, whereas our folks over here are doing a lot better? What can we do to homogenize our products? So part of this isn't just on the regulatory side. In some ways, it's taking into the hands of the people that are in the industry to kind of find a way to ensure the product quality despite the changes in the federal laws, because at some point it might change, maybe it won't, we'll see. But in the meantime, I think it's still important to have kind of a consistent and quality product in order to be a successful company within the cannabis space.
I like that point, Dylan, and I want to go back to Ginny's points though for a second, and just to add, how do the regulations get better? How do we go from version 1 to today, or what we need, let's say, tomorrow? And how do we expect regulators or the legislative bodies to promulgate laws and rules without access to this type of information? And so that's a challenge, right? We can sit there and blame regulators or blame the framework, Congress, whoever we want, but if we're not providing solutions, which then goes to how do we do that, especially if you're on the industry side and you've got a biased lens, right? Because you are in the best interest of your business. So that's goes back to, I don't know how many times we'll plug it, but I think it's there for a reason, back to AOAC, ASTM, and these standards bodies where we can actually provide that information and hand it to the regulators, both to use and, more importantly, before that, to provide feedback to make sure that it actually works, which goes back to the bigger concept of fit for purpose that we're talking about here. So this is how we can work together, and how we are working together as an industry, whether you're a lab, an operator, and a producer, or a public health person, a consumer, to establish what really matters and how do we do it. We can create that framework to have a more unified system across the country that makes everybody's lives easier at the end of the day. Because I don't think anybody wakes up saying, how can I make my life more difficult than it was before I went to bed last night? Like, nobody wants that. So we're, believe it or not, all on the same page. Just how do we get there? It requires a lot of coordination and collaboration.
Absolutely. So we've learned a lot in this industry over the last 10 years that we've seen adult use legalization just in Colorado. So when it comes to fit for purpose testing methods in our industry, what would you like regulators to know 10 years in so far? Ginny?
Dylan, you want to take this one first?
Sure, I can give my 2 cents first. That's fine. I think one of the things that this is a little bit of an aside from that, but I think it's really important that the folks that are in the license space, like the license space, are doing the work to try to do a better job. You know, we're participating in ASTM where they're trying to make regulations. Obviously, people are trying their best to create an industry where there's a safe and effective product. And one of the things that I think worries me is there's kind of this other side of the unlicensed and sort of black market and gray market side of things. And I think that's really important when we consider fit for purpose to also consider, hey, how do we try to force regulation in that space as well? Because we kind of are trying to create the safety net where we're really being careful about trying to make sure the net's all safe and it's going to catch people and everything. Meanwhile, there's a hole over here where people are falling right through. So I think part of the advice I would give is that we can apply a lot of the things that we're learning from the licensed and regulated cannabis space to that unregulated space. And I certainly don't have any problem with things like hemp-derived cannabinoids by any means, but I do feel like they should be something that's safe and tested and labeled correctly. And so having that, what we're learning and understanding on the regulated side be applied to that kind of less regulated side is I think an important step for the cannabis industry to take.
Yeah, I agree with Dylan on that point. I think that's a really good point. For me, one of the things I want, to be able to tell regulators is that, the labs who care and the labs who want to get us to fit for purpose testing are going to be willing to provide the data to get us there. As a laboratory, you can't go to your state regulator and be like, I don't like your rules. And when they ask why, you're like, just because I don't. Like, that's not going to get you anywhere. So working with your regulators at the state level, working with regulators, who are involved in AOAC and ASTM and having conversations with them and saying, but here's the data backing up why this may not be fit for purpose. Backing up the data with, okay, this isn't going to work for the way we're testing to be able to provide accurate data. And that's an important part about it. So for me, it's, almost having the regulators, when a lab comes to them and says they don't like a rule, come back and ask them, okay, well, where's the data showing that this rule doesn't work? Because that's really how we're going to make a difference. That's that collaboration and that conversation. That's an important part of this, because there are some rules that have been created in regulations that are there for a reason. And even though a lab might not like them, they're there to protect the consumer. And so those regulations don't necessarily need to change, but there are some that may not be fit for purpose. Requiring labs to have all pesticides, 77 pesticides passing QC at 70 to 130% when they're spiking them in. If you look at what is happening in the environmental world, that is nowhere near what's happening in the environmental world. Some of the recovery limits in the environmental world are 0 to 200% because some of these pesticides just don't behave. So having those conversations and providing that data to regulators and working with them rather than against them is a really important part that I think labs need to remember, is that the regulators are here to regulate you, but they're not here to be the bad guy. They're here to regulate. And they can, if you help each other, you can make a change and you can make progress.
Great points. Thank you so much. So let's talk about how cannabis businesses can leverage insights that are gained from fit for purpose testing to improve product development and quality control and customer satisfaction. Dylan?
Sure, yeah, I'll start on that. I think there's the one thing I always see is that there's a lot of momentum that can be gained there and a lot of talk around quality, and that's obviously very important. Everybody wants to have a high quality product. That's what's going to sell better. But at the end of the day, a lot of the operators are worried about things like costs. And I think there's a really important factor to this fit for purpose kind of style testing that enables you to save money, which is in some ways more important, especially, in the current climate where margins are razor thin. If you look at things like, hey, let's test early and often, you can find problems really early, and that can save you a lot of money. You can also find unicorns really early, or things that are going to, give you an advantage. For example, finding an interesting cultivar. But one example that we found from someone we know is that they made several pallets of a infused beverage. And then when they got the test results back from the lab, it was lower than expected for several reasons. But now they've got this whole palette of things they can't sell. And it was something like, over $1 million worth of product had to be destroyed. And if they had just done a $50 to $100 test on it before they bottled, they would have had, a chance to make some correction and do something about it. So I think that ability to apply this fit for purpose across all the way from raw materials up to the final product is really an important part of it. And it's really where cost savings can become an important part of the conversation. It's something that makes a company more money rather than just be about quality and safety. Not that those aren't important, of course.
Yeah, I definitely have to second Dylan on that one. I mean, testing often, testing from the beginning, testing things as you go along. It may seem like a cost up front, but in the end, it could potentially save a company a lot of money, especially when it comes to quality. Because if you are not doing R&D on a product and all of a sudden something fails final product, you've got a whole different list of problems than had you just tested the product from the beginning to see kind of what was going on, especially new products. And it doesn't just go to testing your cannabis. Let's test what we're putting into our cannabis. There are so many different things that are being put into these products to make derivative products, and that stuff can impact that final result. Those can contain pesticides, heavy metals. Your vape cartridges could leach heavy metals. There's so many different potentials of where contamination can be added that will impact your quality. And there's so many ways to alleviate that. And I think that when we think about fit for purpose, a lot of times we think about the final product testing, but we also need to think about the input testing, the testing throughout, the quality testing, doing what Dylan's company does, where they can do on-site testing so that you can kind of start to measure your cannabinoid content before it gets to a lab. So you have an idea of what's going on in your plants. These are all really important parts of that final fit for purpose compliance testing.
Great. Well, we have just a couple more pre-written questions here for the webinar, and then we've gotten quite a few pre-registration questions and some live Q&A questions. If anyone else wants to get their Q&A questions, now would be a great time. So let's say I'm an operator who tests my products in what I believe to be the correct method, but I'm definitely not getting the results that I want. What should I do?
This is a tough one. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about, well, the test result is giving you the wrong thing, that's pretty easy. You can figure out what you're doing wrong and fix it. But oftentimes it means, hey, your product is different than what you're expecting, and that can be really challenging. It's never really easy in a lot of ways to kind of dig down and get to the root of, hey, like, for example, in the beverage case that I'm talking about, it ended up being something to do with the packaging they were storing it in, and it was absorbing the nanoemulsion. So there's this long, complicated reason that it wasn't because they were just dosing it in quickly. It was something complicated. And I think it took them a while to figure that out. And I think at the end of the day, it's worth it, because if you didn't do that, you're going to end up with your next batch having the same issue. So I think the short answer is there's not really an easy shortcut to understanding it. I think the real thing is, when you have a problem like this, you've got to dig into it and get to the root cause, because otherwise you're just going to be wasting the same time again and spinning your wheels. So again, it kind of comes back to that thing where a test is kind of considered a four-letter word, but in a lot of ways, it's really an important tool to ensure that at the end of the day, you're going to have a product that's what you expect it to be. So I think the short answer is put in the work, I guess.
Yeah, I think root cause analysis is the way to go, not just for testing labs, but also for operators. If you don't do a root cause analysis, you're not going to know how to correct the problem in the future. And if you don't know how to correct the problem in the future, there's a high possibility it's going to happen again.
So retrace your steps. Got it. All right. All right, before we move on to the pre-registration questions and Q&A questions, what advice would you give to cannabis industry professionals who are seeking to optimize their testing protocols and ensure that their products are meeting the highest standards of quality and safety?
I'll take this one first. I think that my biggest advice is to work with organizations like ASTM, AOAC, USP, ACIL, NLCL, and NCLC, working with all of those organizations who are pushing for this standardization and the development of validated protocols is a really important part of optimizing what you're doing in the laboratory, because it really provides an avenue for laboratories to collaborate, not even just across the nation, but internationally. When we look at ASTM and AOAC, these are both international organizations. So we can have conversations with people who may have had the problem we're having 6 months ago. I'm a cannabis lab in Florida, but a cannabis lab in California may have run into my issue 6 months ago. But if I'm never collaborating with them and having these conversations, how can we solve the problem? There's no point in constantly reinventing the wheel when we have others we can rely on. So collaboration, collaboration, collaboration is a really big thing for me.
And alphabet soup.
I mean, I'm going to go ahead and kind of plug what she said as well. For sure, the standard organizations are a great way to ensure that the industry moves forward. And if you're not putting in what you're getting out of it, it's never going to be a better industry. And I think we all want that. And the only other thing I'll say is, just simply test early and test often, and you're going to find that that's going to help you out.
David, you're the vice chair of D37 ASTM Committee on Cannabis. Anything you'd like to add about that?
I can't do anything, I think, better justice than just echoing what both Jenny and Dylan said. I mean, just a reminder, I recognize that, especially depending on where you come from in the industry or legacy market, there's a lot of barriers and, trauma, for lack of a better word, around, sharing information and trust, whether it was trust with your competitors or folks, down the street, or, government. And so that is something that if we don't figure out how to get over as individuals and as an industry, we're only hurting ourselves. So really that collaborative spirit, and that's where, again, the final plug, maybe, I don't know, we'll probably have a couple more of, these standards organizations have been around for over a century, right? US Pharmacopoeia has been around for 202 years now, and they have solved major problems and prevented so many major problems from happening. Same thing with ASTM, with, from aerospace to, the roads, asphalt, bridges, all the structural integrity, children's toys, etc. There's safety and safeguards in place because of what those organizations provide for a framework for industry. So they don't have a vested interest. ASTM has no expert staff on cannabis there at the table. They are simply a 126 now year old organization that provides the process for us to come together with our different perspectives and biases to work together. And there's no better way to address this and get over these hurdles than by using these trusted frameworks as a neutral convener to get to the end goals that we all want together.
Great. So I'm looking through some of these pre-registration submitted questions and some that have been submitted during the webinar. ASTM coming up again. Claire mentioned something about water activity informing safety and quality, and how including ASTM standard D8917, a standard for maintaining acceptable water activity range for dry cannabis flower, using it as part of the process control to ensure safety and more consistent potency results. I think that's a great point as well. Continuing to look through these questions. Also, a compendium of analytical methods for the cannabis industry can be developed and supported by test-specific, proven to be accurate and reproducible analytical methods in-house, and third-party audits must be included. Example of ISO 17025. Very interesting, yes. Also a question about medical marijuana patients where financial resources are limited and marginalized in the legacy market. How do they have confidence in a product without a COA, and what test should a medical marijuana patient request for a legacy product test? Any thoughts on that one?
I guess probably neither of us have a huge amount of experience in the legacy side from the testing perspective. But a couple of things I can say. I mean, part of the reason that the licensed, legalized industry exists is because we want to create a safer, better product. So there was the hope or the desire of the industry is to provide safe, effective products. So if possible, I know it's not possible everywhere, I would say err on the side of going for a licensed product where the testing is done. But other than that, in some states it's allowed to send products in. There's oftentimes labs have a safety panel test, and that's probably the most important thing. If you're looking at it, potency is one thing, but really making sure there's none of those really dangerous pesticides or molds or heavy metals is really more important. So I would err on that side if you had the capability of testing. But again, I would focus on trying to get from the legal non-legacy market if the safety and quality is a concern, which it should be.
Yeah. I'll add to that, and I like to use analogies. Hopefully this is helpful for folks. If you think about, you've got your grocery store, pick your big grocery store chain, you've got your farmer's market, and then you've got your own backyard, right? And if you're producing an agriculture, a vegetable, whether tomatoes, lettuce, or whatnot, it's bananas, and you go to the grocery store, the bananas might be coming from Costa Rica or Peru, but they've gone through, import inspections, and there's quality standards around that for product release, so that you don't think twice, can I trust this banana or this product on the store shelf at a grocery store? You go to the farmers market, slightly different, right? These are generally local co-op farmers, and oftentimes you get to meet the farmer, and this all, so that what I'm underpinning here is like the concept of trust. How do you trust and know and have confidence in your product? Well, you go to the farmer's market, it's been around for years, you see the same farmer there every time, and you get to know them and you trust their product. They did not go through the same import standard testing and protocols that those products at your grocery store may have, but they had some level of oversight, and you establish trust. And then you've got your backyard or your neighbor's backyard, or a farm share down the street. You know the farm, you know the location, you know the soil, you have trust in the people that touched and provided nutrients and watered and grew those plants. So when you go to the legacy market, if we're talking about that, it goes back to, how do you trust? How do you know? And there's so many studies that have shown that those products are not safe, that they have high levels of pesticides and heavy metals, et cetera. So if you're in a state where you don't have access to these products, that's an unfortunate, I feel for you. We don't have a solution right now besides trying to go to the regulated marketplace, because you need to have confidence in these products. And how can you do that? Again, if you know somebody and you trust them, go that route. Find somebody you know and trust. Otherwise, go to the regulated marketplace where there are safeguards, and you can call your attorney general. You can request a C of A. You can talk to the regulators and hear your voice of any concerns that you see.
Great point. Can I trust this banana is my new battle cry. Here's a great question. How much random testing should a dispensary do on products, since they're presumably receiving COAs with the product from the grower or manufacturer? Thoughts on that?
So I'm in Florida, which is a vertically integrated market. So the producer is going to be the same person who's manufacturing and dispensing. But I know that this is a really big thing in other industries where it's not a vertically, or other markets where it's not a vertically integrated market, because that testing, you're ultimately relying on the person who said they conducted the test. And so I think that kind of goes back to David and the trust conversation he had is, are you working with a grower or manufacturer who you trust? Are you working with someone? And if you don't, then that's kind of your decision on whether or not you want to randomly test these products and how often you want to randomly test these products. I think that this even kind of opens the avenue to the whole hemp conversation of, how is hemp being tested? How are hemp-derived cannabinoids being tested? How is that product being tested for safety? Because in a lot of markets, I don't necessarily know if those safety regulations are as strict as the cannabis markets. So if you are someone who has a dispensary that is selling hemp products, those products may be ones you want to be more concerned with doing randomized testing on, because they may be more susceptible to not having the correct information. Just in my personal experience of what we've kind of seen in the industry.
And I'll kind of echo that, but I do think that testing is an important part of it, of course. I mean, just being able to build that trust, like a trust but verify, is really an important way to do it. Understanding that, hey, this person is consistently giving me product that I can test on site and say, yep, this is good, is important. But I'll also congratulate you on talking about the hemp derived market, where that's even more of an issue because there's no regulation. So, and I think in that case, you're going to need a lot more testing than you would where you're in a regulated market where you understand, the people are following rules that have consequences if they break them. So I think the testing protocols need to be more strict if you're doing things like hemp-derived cannabinoids versus kind of an illegal market.
If I can just briefly add, right? Think about this question really applies to anywhere in the supply chain, right? Whether you're in, I'm a big Costco fan, Kirkland brands. How do you think those products get onto the store shelves? Trust but verify, exactly what Dylan said. They don't just say, oh, I know this person down the street has offered to sell me, 5,000 cartons of eggs a week. There's protocols, there's audits and inspections, both planned and unplanned, and then random product testing to verify that it's what they say it is, because mistakes happen. That's the whole point of quality programs, and quality assurance, being proactive to mitigate the risk, and then doing, random spot inspection tests. So whether you're a dispensary or, a CBD store where, and if you're a consumer, where does the CBD store, how do they qualify their products that come on the shelves? If you're the CBD store, how are you qualifying the products? If you're the manufacturer, how are you qualifying your raw material, whether it's sugar, pectin, or cannabis oil? Same things apply. Trust and verify, have those protocols in place. So hopefully that's helpful.
And one other thing that kind of important, I just want to, sorry to keep beating this dead horse, but on the hemp derived side, they're looking at things like THCA flower or Delta-8 materials that potentially could contain Delta-9. If you're the smoke shop that's selling it, you could be left with the handcuffs on your hands if you sell this product even inadvertently. So it is scary and it's unfortunate, but that's the reality of the situation, is that the minute the Delta-9 gets above X%, depending on your jurisdiction, you could be in trouble, and it's not easy to tell the difference, and the testing isn't always very consistent or even real in a lot of cases. So just a little bit of buyer beware, unfortunately. And again, why a regulated market is in a lot of cases more safer, really.
Great. Well, we have just a minute left here, and unfortunately unable to get to all of the Q&A and pre-registration questions. I'll share those with our guests and see if they have anything to add, and we'll include that in our follow-up email. If there's any final thoughts you'd like to add before I close us out, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, thanks to everyone.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that you were willing to spend some time with us.
Great.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. I think it's a really important conversation for the industry to have. And I'm really thankful for GMP Collective for hosting this so that we can start having these conversations.
Great.
Absolutely. Thanks
so
everyone
much,
for an
Janine and Dylan.
amazing webinar. Thanks everyone who attended live. Reminder that all past episodes can be found on GMP Collective's website in case you missed one, and feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. And if you are interested in learning more and working with us, the GMP Collective offers strategic advising, subject matter expertise, data-driven solutions, and more. So secure success for your business now by visiting gmpcollective.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next month.
See ya.